Throughout this text, we have emphasized that individuals are made up of systems at various levels: motor, perceptual, cognitive, and social. These developmental systems are intertwined. Perception and cognition are required to carry out actions, while actions generate perceptions, provide knowledge, and promote social interaction. This chapter focuses on the interrelationship between perception and movement actions. Developmentalists have long suspected that movement through the environment is vital for the coupling of perceptions and purposeful movements in the environment. Historically, motor development, perceptual development, and cognitive development were studied separately and treated as distinct systems. In part, this view of distinct systems harks back to mind-body dualism as outlined by Descartes in the 17th century. Developmentalists in the 1960s pointed out how important perceptual development was to both motor development and cognitive development. Developmentalists saw perception as a precursor to both movement and cognition, and they proposed that children with learning disabilities had deficits in perceptual development. Further, they hypothesized that perceptual motor activity programs could remediate deficits. Early on, there appeared to be empirical support for these theories, and programs as children placed in the remedial programs showed improved classroom performance. Eventually, sufficient information from well-designed evaluations failed to show that participation in a perceptual motor program produced improvements in readiness skills, intelligence, classroom achievement, or language. Piaget in 1952 proposed that reality is constructed by relating action to sensory information. Today, educators and therapists are cautious about claims that participation in a perceptual motor program can remediate learning deficiencies. Yet, they realize that such participation is beneficial for children with and without learning difficulties. Most current physical education curricula for young children devote significant time to perceptual motor activities. Perceptual motor programs can be either comprehensive or focused on certain aspects of perception. Until we understand more about the links between perception, cognition, and action, the most realistic claims for perceptual motor programs are those focused on the development of motor skills. Motor development and cognitive development may be more interrelated than previously thought, even to the extent of being fundamentally intertwined. Other research has focused on a group of brain proteins called brain-derived neurotrophic factors, or BDNFs. Hormones called growth factors are released when circulation increases, as with exercise. These factors work with BDNFs, and one of them stimulates capillary growth in the brain. Several contemporary educators report success in promoting active learning for both normally developing and exceptional learners. Active learning is the notion that movement activates the brain and facilitates learning, in contrast to passive learning environments that require learners to sit quietly, watching and listening to a teacher. The ecological view of development embraces the notion of a close link between perception and action. The ecological view holds that the newborn infant perceives the environment and many of its properties before the onset of purposeful movements. Thus, the infant has a somewhat limited perception, which guides a movement, which in turn generates additional perceptions. The cycle is repeated, and the infant eventually refines perception. This sequence is termed a perception-action loop. Perception develops ahead of movement skills. In 1963, Held and Hines studied early motor activity in kittens. They kept the visual experience identical for all the kittens by placing them in pairs in a merry-go-round apparatus. One of the pair was harnessed but could walk around, which was the active kitten, whereas the other was restricted to riding in a gondola, the passive kitten. The passive kittens later failed to accurately judge depth and failed to exhibit paw placing or eye blinking when an object approached. Self-produced locomotion appears to facilitate development of depth perception. Kamoyan and Campos in 1988 also investigated the link between infants' self-produced locomotion and their perception of spatial relationships. The more locomotor experience infants had, the better they scored. Locomotor experience facilitates development of spatial perception. Lockman in 1984 tested infants longitudinally starting at age 8 months and identified a sequence of improvements in spatial perception. First, infants learn to retrieve an object hidden behind a cloth. Some weeks after, they can reach around a barrier to obtain a goal. Then, infants can move themselves around the barrier to obtain their goal, and most infants can successfully detour around an opaque barrier before they can travel around a transparent barrier. Another line of research involves perception of surfaces. Gibson et al. 1987 presented infants with crawling experience and walking experience with a rigid surface, such as a cloth over plywood, and a deforming surface, such as a cloth over a waterbed. The crawlers showed no preference, but the walkers chose the rigid surface. Consistent with the notion of direct perception, developmentalists with an ecological perspective believe that We directly perceive what the objects and surfaces in the environment permit us to do, given our own capabilities. That is, we perceive affordances. As an individual grows and develops, her perception of affordances might change as her action capabilities change, even though an object's physical properties remain the same. If we perceive affordances rather than object characteristics, then individuals must be sensitive to the scale of their bodies. Warren, in 1984, tested this notion with adults and found that individuals perceive stairs with a riser height of more than 88% to 89% of their leg length to be unclimbable by means of alternate stepping. Infants seem to remember the results of their own previous actions with surfaces and slopes, and can perceive the properties of objects in the following order: size and temperature, texture and hardness, weight and shape. Through trial and error, infants gradually explore forms of tool use, relating objects to other objects and surfaces. In doing so, infants detect affordances. These are not affordances of individual tools, but affordances of the relationships between objects. Tool use depends on properties of both the tool and the surface or another object. Early arm movements, such as banging objects, become tuned for later percussive tool use. Our sensitivity to body scaling has implications for skill instruction. If a child cannot swing a big, heavy adult tennis racket with one hand, the child cannot use adult technique in the sport. Either the racket must be scaled down to fit the child, or the child might need to use two hands to swing the racket. Continued research is necessary to determine the reference scales that individuals use for particular tasks. Such research would help determine whether it is, indeed, an affordance or individual characteristics of objects that are perceived. The deprivation of action experience puts an individual at risk of deficient perceptual development. Action must be coupled with perception so that individuals can deal with events or movements that disturb their posture and balance. Several perceptual systems are involved in maintaining posture and balance: vision, kinesthetic input from our body's proprioceptors, kinesthetic input from the vestibular system, and the auditory system can provide information about balance. We must be able to maintain posture and balance in an almost infinite number of situations. Think of all the body parts on which gymnasts must hold their balance in various events. The triangular model of constraints provides a good perspective on the development of balance. Performance improves on a variety of balance tasks from 3 to 19 years of age. Balancing during locomotion is a challenging task. When we walk or run, for example, we must maintain our stability, yet propel the body forward in order to travel. To do so, we probably use two frames of reference. One is the supporting surface, and the other is gravity. The strategy to maintain quiet stance is likely to use sensory feedback, with vision being particularly important for children. Disturbances to balance require fast motor responses to maintain stability. Asciante and Ablard in 1995 and 1998 proposed a model to explain the development of balance in locomotion over the lifespan. The model describes 4 important periods. The first covers birth to the onset of standing and is characterized by a cephalocaudal or head-to-toe direction of muscle control. The second includes the achievement of upright stance to about 6 years of age. The third period is characterized by the refinement of head stabilization and balance control. The fourth and last period is characterized by refined control of the degrees of freedom of movement in the neck. Asciante, Woolacott, and Amblard in 2000 observed anticipatory postural adjustments in all ages. Yet with aging, the adjustments were more consistent and body segments were better coordinated. When experiencing a large enough balance perturbation, adults can take a step or two to regain balance. New walkers rarely stepped to regain balance. Adults use visual information to stabilize the head and upper body. When adults stand on a platform and is moved slightly, they use ankle strategy. When the movement is larger or faster, a hip strategy is used. Older adults experience a decline in the ability to balance. Those over 60 sway more than younger adults when standing upright. In comparison with younger adults, slightly more time passes before an older adult's leg muscles respond after a perturbation in order to maintain balance. And sometimes the upper leg muscles respond first, instead of the lower leg muscles. Some older adults experience changes in the kinesthetic receptors. This could lead to an over-reliance on vision to maintain balance. A decrease in fast-twitch muscle fibers or a loss of strength could hamper an older adult's quick response to changes in ability. Perrin et al. In 1997 determined that nerve conduction speed in both the peripheral and central nervous systems were slower in the older adults. Falls are a significant concern in older adults. In fact, falls are the leading cause of accidental death for people over 75 years of age. A common result of falling, especially among older adults with osteoporosis, is fracture of the spine, hip, or wrist. Complications of such a fracture can result in death. A fear of falling again can make them change their lifestyle or be overly cautious in subsequent activities. Research since has firmly established the benefit of balance training for older adults. Prevention and rehabilitation programs then are useful in reducing the risk of falls in older adults, but they must be ongoing.